Support for this podcast and the following message come from ADT Security, helping to protect families and homes for over 140 years. The ADT yard sign is more than a sign. It's a line in the sand. For what matters most, there's ADT. Learn more at ADT.com.
From WBUR Boston and NPR, I'm Tom Ashbrook, and this is On Point. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis made an unannounced stop in Afghanistan yesterday, days after the Taliban carried out an attack that killed more than 140, 50, 60 Afghan troops and support staff on a military base there. U.S. generals are asking for thousands more U.S. troops to send into a conflict that is in its 16th year with no end in sight. The U.S. dropped the mother of all bombs there this month, but the Taliban has 40% of the country. Russia is accused of arming them now. This hour on Point, how long does the U.S. stay in Afghanistan? You can join us on air or online, where this conversation is always on. What should happen here after nearly 16 years? Join us anytime at onpointradio.org or on Twitter and Facebook at onpointradio. It has been rough going. The U.S. generals want more troops now, thousands more, they're saying. On ABC's This Week, this was April 16th, just a few days after the big bomb was dropped there on the mountains near the Pakistan border. Martha Raddatz asked National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster about U.S. efforts to stabilize the Afghan government. He was at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and he said the struggle, he depicted it in kind of apocalyptic terms. What's going on with the U.S. and Afghanistan?
This is really the modern-day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And so with those high stakes in mind, recognizing that the Taliban groups that we're fighting here, that the ISIS groups that we, alongside really the Afghan forces, are really fighting, and we're just enabling them in the eastern part of the country, are a threat to all civilized peoples.
The modern-day frontier between barbarism and civilization. How can you walk away from a conflict like that, and yet nearly 16 years? Let's go first to Kabul, Afghanistan, and Joshua Smith, Afghanistan reporter for Reuters. Joshua, welcome to On Point. What is the latest death toll from that northern Afghan military base where there was such a huge slaughter, and how did they pull that off again, the Taliban?
Thanks for having me. As you mentioned, the death toll that we've heard so far is upwards of 140 to 160, but officials privately say that it's much higher than that. They say that they're afraid that releasing those full numbers could be a blow to the morale of the Afghan forces, who are already struggling here to combat both the Taliban insurgency as well as Islamic State. Now, a lot of questions around how they were able to get into that base. Unfortunately, this is one of the things that Afghans have often had to deal with here. Just a few weeks ago, Islamic State militants were able to make their way, again under disguise, onto a hospital here in the heart of Kabul. So this type of attack is unfortunately all too common.
James Mattis has been in Kabul in the last 24 hours, and generals there are saying, or not denying, that Russians, the U.S. military is now suggesting, or saying nearly, are arming the Taliban. What's known about that, Josh?
So for some time, probably about the last year, both Afghan and American officials have complained that Russia was providing legitimacy to the Taliban. It's only very recently, and in fact these comments here in Kabul were some of the most explicit yet from American officials, them accusing Russia of actually sending weapons to the Taliban. So there are still very few details known about that. However, senior American officials did tell us that some of those weapons could include machine guns, so some of these kind of heavier weapons that can be used to devastating effect here.
Longest war in American history, and after all that time, nearly 16 years, we're reading that the Taliban now controls something like 40% of the country in Afghanistan. Can you just kind of describe where are they? If you lay out a map of Afghanistan, what does the Taliban control? Where are they most active? Where are the fighting lines? And what about ISIS? How do they fit into that map?
Well, the Taliban have been able to expand in many areas that were their traditional strongholds. So in the east, along the border with Pakistan, as well in the south and southwest in places like Helmand, which many people have heard quite a lot about. Most of Helmand, for example, these days is either under Taliban control or under a lot of threat from their forces. What's interesting, though, is in the last few years since the international military coalition here declared an end to its combat mission, the Taliban have also made inroads in places like the north, where this recent attack on the base happened up in Mazar-e-Sharif, which had traditionally been areas that had been much more free of Taliban influence and, in fact, had been kind of a success story up until recently.
What about ISIS, Josh?
So the Islamic State has not had as much success here as it has in, say, Syria and Iraq, where it's been able to seize, major cities and wide swaths of territory. Here, it's mostly been confined to a small area along the Afghanistan and Pakistan border. This is in part because the Taliban themselves have fought ISIS for influence and control in some of these regions. That being said, Islamic State has claimed responsibility for some of the most deadly attacks ever launched in Kabul, including, for example, that recent attack on the hospital.
And the message from General Mattis to U.S. forces in Afghanistan, I guess there are about 8,000 or 9,000 there now, and to the Afghan government, what do you know?
So Mattis was not providing very more details about what the Trump administration will decide to do here in the future. However, the message that he did bring seemed to be a lot of continuing what we have seen. So continuing to train the Afghan forces, continuing to conduct counterterrorism missions against groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And he also used some of the same rhetoric that you heard from McMaster a little bit earlier, describing what he saw as the barbarism of the Taliban and Islamic State. Again, setting up rhetoric that certainly sets the stage for continued United States presence here in Afghanistan.
Josh, what's the mood there among Afghans? I mean, I know they're of many stripes, but do they see an end in sight? Do people want America to stay? Is there a sharp dividing line within society about stay or go?
Afghans tend to be mixed about the international presence here. Obviously, they would prefer that the situation not require any kind of military force, including their own. Longing, of course, as anybody would, for a more peaceful and prosperous nation here. However, many do support or are asking for more, at least not necessarily more troops, but definitely more aid from the West. So more weapons, more training for the Afghan security forces.
There's been so much already. Here we are in the 16th year. Joshua Smith, Afghanistan correspondent for Reuters, in Kabul with us today. Josh, thank you very much for being with us. Here's now Defense Secretary James Mattis in Kabul yesterday saying this is going to be a tough year.
We're under no illusions about the challenges associated with this mission. 2017 is going to be another tough year for the valiant Afghan security forces and the international troops who have stood and will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Afghanistan against terrorism and against those who seek to undermine the legitimate United Nations recognized government of this nation.
The U.S. Defense Secretary in Kabul yesterday, and here, the commander of American-led military forces in Afghanistan and the NATO mission there, General John Nicholson. This was back in Washington before the Senate Armed Services Committee in February, saying maybe they need a few thousand more troops.
I have adequate resourcing in my counterterrorism mission. In my train, advise, and assist mission, however, we have a shortfall of a few thousand. And this is in the NATO train, advise, assist mission. So this can come from the U.S. and its allies.
Let's look at what the U.S. might do with that desire for more troops. Nancy Youssef is Pentagon and national security reporter for BuzzFeed News. She joins us from Washington. Nancy, welcome back to On Point.
Great to be with you.
Do the stars look aligned for the Trump administration to send thousands more U.S. troops back into Afghanistan?
Right. The numbers that we've heard is somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. And what's interesting about that number is the U.S. had that many additional troops along with its coalition partners just a few months ago. And as part of this effort to draw down, a lot of those troops came back, such that the U.S. presence is now at 8,400. There's been an emphasis from here that those troops don't have to be U.S. forces, but that they could be coalition ones. But it really speaks to sort of the, I think, intersection of politics and war fighting, in the sense that privately, I think generals would not have wanted to lose those troops a few months ago, and the fact that we're now revisiting this conversation about having more troops in speaks to some of the challenges of a war in its 16th year, where people want to see a drawdown and success, and the U.S. military repeatedly arguing essentially we need more time to get the Afghan forces in place such that they can defend their nation on their own.
Been an awful lot of efforts at prepping Afghan forces, 100,000 U.S. troops there at the peak. The Obama administration had its surge in Afghanistan and then drew down. Does the Trump White House have an appetite for sending thousands more troops into Afghanistan, Nancy? Can you tell?
Well, it doesn't seem so, certainly not to the figures that we saw in the past. There seems to be this attempt to kind of find that sweet spot, which is essentially the minimal number of troops such that the Taliban does not continue to gain influence and power and territory, particularly in urban settings. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, and a three-star general visited Afghanistan before the Mattis trip, in part to have a first-hand understanding of the situation there ahead of this discussion that's happening at the White House about the numbers. The fact that the U.S. is talking about somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 and including NATO partners suggests that actually there's a real effort to minimize the amount of U.S. troops that would be in Afghanistan again.
How much has the U.S. spent in Afghanistan already in these nearly 16 years?
You know, it's a funny thing, and that's a number that's very hard to say because it depends on how you measure it. Certainly billions, some would argue $1 trillion when you count the costs of health care for those who are injured in the war. It's an almost impossible number, hundreds of millions, if not billions, just on training Afghan forces, an equal amount on building up infrastructure in Afghanistan. It's literally a number that nobody can say for certain with any certainty because it's been over such a long period of time and involves such a big investment.
Nancy Youssef, Pentagon and National Security reporter for BuzzFeed News, as much as $1 trillion all in. Nancy, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. Talking this hour about Afghanistan and what to do at almost 16 years and counting. Lots has been tried there. A lot of training, a lot of fighting. Plenty of Americans have died there and others from NATO countries. Mother of all bombs dropped, this goes back to the middle of April. Here was a report on that from CBS News on an ISIS cave complex near the Pakistan border.
The bomb, all 21,600 pounds of it, was aimed at the center of an ISIS cave complex in Afghanistan. When it detonated at 7:32 in the evening local time, it set off a massive pressure wave that would have literally crushed the life out of fighters hiding in the caves. The massive ordnance air blast, as it is officially called, sent a mushroom-like cloud towering into the sky.
Okay, it was a big explosive, and maybe it killed some ISIS there, moved a lot of rock around. Did it change the war? The next week, here we've got Taliban coming onto an Afghan base and just slaughtering Afghan troops and personnel there. Here's a report from the BBC on the Afghan military base attack last Friday.
Officials say at least 140 soldiers died when 10 or more insurgents entered the base, firing on men as they emerged from the mosque and prepared for lunch. Witnesses said some attackers blew themselves up among fleeing men.
And response here yesterday, Afghanistan's defense minister, Abdullah Habibi, resigned.
To solve the problem in the national interest, like the soldiers who sacrificed themselves in the battle, it's necessary for me to sacrifice my position.
Okay, so he's out, moving on, but the U.S. is not. You can join the conversation this hour. Can you believe it's been nearly 16 years since those weeks after the attacks of 9/11 that the U.S. has been in Afghanistan now? How long should we keep at this? Do you believe the U.S. can bring peace, security, a stable government, and effective police force to Afghanistan with the mother of all bombs dropped and more Marines going in? Are you ready to double down, triple down, get the hell out? Let's look at this. Aaron O'Connell joins us right now, military historian, former director of defense policy and strategy on the National Security Council for the Obama administration, served in Afghanistan in 2010, 2011. He's reserve lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps now and has edited a terrific book of essays on the Afghan war called Our Latest Longest War, Losing Hearts and Minds in Afghanistan. He'll be a professor starting in August of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Aaron O'Connell in Washington, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
And with us from New York, Max Boot joins us, Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, author of Invisible Armies, an epic history of guerrilla warfare from ancient times to the present. Max Boot, welcome back to On Point.
Happy to be here.
Max, can we just go first to that enormous bomb? It got a lot of attention. It was, the fact of it having been dropped kind of waved around to North Korea as proof, don't mess with this president, the vice president said when he was there. Was it consequential, Max? What did you make of that? Why would that be dropped, and what's the result?
I thought all this chest thumping over the dropping of the mother of all bombs, this 21,000-pound munition, was vastly out of place and overblown, because this is not a sign of success. When you're having to drop 21,000-pound munitions in a war against guerrillas, you are not doing well in that war. John Paul Vann, the legendary counterinsurgent in Vietnam, used to say that the ideal weapon in a counterinsurgency is a knife, and if that's not possible, then a rifle. But if you're actually facing an enemy which has gone to the level where you need to fight them with artillery and massive airstrikes, that means they are very powerful. And in the case of ISIS in Nangarhar province, where this bomb was dropped, they're powerful enough that the Afghan army, special operations forces, could not maneuver in there on the ground, and so they had to stand back and let the U.S. drop this massive bomb. But that's a sign of how the Taliban and ISIS, Haqqani Network, and others have become pervasive on the ground and contest or control roughly a third of the country, which is about 10 million of Afghanistan's 30 million people, according to General Nicholson, the U.S. commander there. So this is a worrisome sign. It means the dropping of the mother of all bombs means the opposite of what the message that most people took away from it. In my mind, it's bad news. It's not good news.
A kind of sign of desperation. You know something about Afghanistan. You served as an advisor to U.S. commanders there and in Iraq. Should we stay or should we go, Max?
I think we're trapped. I don't think we can afford to leave, because if we leave, I think there's a very real risk that the Taliban will overrun the country, and then they will come back with their friends in Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani Network and various international jihadist groups. I think this would be a terrible blow in the fight against terrorism, and it would destabilize Pakistan as well, which is a nuclear-armed state. So I don't think we can just afford to bug out. But on the other hand, I don't think we're going to be winning a victory anytime soon. The war is kind of locked in a stalemate, where, as I mentioned, the Taliban essentially control or contest about a third of the country, and the other two-thirds is in government hands. And I think that stalemate can be preserved in perpetuity, more or less, with a slightly larger commitment of U.S. forces of the kind that General Nicholson called for, several thousand more advisors. I think that would be wise to do. And I think this deployment is sustainable and unavoidable. We're not taking heavy U.S. casualties. The Afghan forces are taking really heavy casualties, and that's very worrisome as to whether that's sustainable. But I think the U.S. deployment, which is currently about 8,500, could be increased by several thousand more personnel. And as long as we have 15 to 20,000 international troops in Afghanistan buttressing the government, I don't think they're going to fall. So I think it's not ideal, but I think it's not this dramatic rallying cry. But I think the best we can hope for is basically to perpetuate the current stalemate and work on increasing government capacity, reducing corruption, increasing the effectiveness of the democratically elected government in Kabul.
Aaron O'Connell, Americans are familiar with wars, Vietnam in particular, where we were told we couldn't afford to leave, we couldn't afford to go. Can we afford to stay in Afghanistan, Aaron?
Well, economically, we can afford to stay. The entire operation right now is costing about $23 billion a year. About 4 to 5 of that goes to training the Afghan National Security Forces. About $18 billion a year goes to sustaining our operations. So it's not economically exorbitant for the defense budget. It makes up something on the order of, I guess, 2 or 3% of the defense budget. And as Max stated, the casualties are not prohibitive. We lose more people to accidents every year than we lose in Afghanistan. But really, one of the deeper questions here is whether or not our presence is making things better and making things worse. Max eloquently stated the logic of staying, which is that hopefully with American dollars and training and advising and assistance, we can professionalize the military forces, we can improve the governance structures of the country. Unfortunately, we really don't have any evidence that that works yet, and we've been doing it for seriously been doing it since about 2009. So we can afford to stay. The question is our presence there actually making a difference? Afghanistan is a deeply multi-ethnic society. There are a lot of centrifugal forces pulling Afghans away from each other by tribe, by clan, by region. But one thing that unites almost all of them is their duty to defend Afghanistan from foreign invasion. And they've done it many times before, 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, a 10-year Soviet occupation. So the real question that needs answering first is whether or not our presence, training and advising the Afghan National Security Forces, whatever benefit is derived from that, does it override the cost of presenting those Afghan forces as foreign-supported occupation forces, which in turn mobilize the Taliban and ISIS?
What about Max's recipe at this moment, more in sorrow or from a lack of alternatives than in any robust happiness about it, but that we should just count on being there in perpetuity and that it's worth it? It's kind of like a police station out there.
I'm not sure it's worth it. I'm not sure it's sustainable either. I understand Max's point of view, and I think it's a solid one. Reasonable people can disagree. We're all trying to predict the future here. But the problem is this. That Afghan army and police isn't just barely holding on. They are losing enormous numbers in the fight, 6,700 last year alone, which is more than double what we've lost in the entire war. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. We're losing a third of the army and the police every year. They leave with the guns we've given them and the training that they've received, and they go back to the hills. The hardest thing to do after a conflict is demobilization and reintegration and disarmament. And we are still arming not just the state forces, but when a third of them disappear each year, we're arming random militias in the hills. That can't be a sustainable future for Afghanistan.
Max, does that mean that we are arming the Taliban in effect? If a third of the army and police defect or slip away every year with their guns, are they ending up in the hands of those who are resisting the American presence and the central government?
Well, I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, there is a high turnover within the Army and a high desertion rate, but the troops often desert simply to go home and be with their families. It's not accurate. I know that Aaron is not saying that a third of the Army deserts to the Taliban every year. That's not the case.
No, I didn't say that, but that's a lot of guns that end up in the countryside, and the Taliban's in the countryside.
Yeah, I mean, sure, we provide arms to the Army, but there's no shortage of guns in Afghanistan in general. There have been for decades. The Taliban have plenty of guns of their own. Now we read that even the Russians are supplying the Taliban. So the problem is that, what would happen if there's no question that Aaron is right to some extent. Yes, that we do help to fuel the conflict. And I think our worst, consequence is all the money that we've put into the system, which turbocharges corruption, which I think is a real problem. And we need to look at that. But the question is, what's the alternative? And if we leave, is there going to be some kind of balance of power between the government and the Taliban? And I'm concerned that's not the case, because even if we pull out our support for the Taliban, for the government, the Taliban will continue to get support from Pakistan, as well as to some extent from Iran and Russia. But Pakistan is the major backer. So unless we're there countering the support that Pakistan is giving to the Taliban, my concern is that you will see a repeat of what happened in the 1990s when the government in Kabul falls to the Taliban, and you have this fundamentalist terrorist-supporting regime in power in Kabul, which, as I said, is not only a big problem in Afghanistan, but it's also going to be a big problem in Pakistan, because all of these jihadist groups on both sides of the border are closely linked to one another. So, I agree with Aaron that, to some extent we do contribute to the problem, but I think, we are also basically the life insurance policy for the democratic elected government in Kabul, which is led by a decent guy, Ashraf Ghani, who's a pro-Western reformer. And I think it's in our interest to continue to support the Ghani government, despite some of the counterproductive consequences of our aid in the past.
Wow. In Afghanistan in perpetuity, Max Boot says, at least that perspective for now. Max Boot, Aaron O'Connell, stand by. Lots of callers for the two of you. Spencer in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Spencer, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to go ahead and say that I agree with Aaron's comments that this is a much older conflict. And just seeing it in terms of a 16-year-old conflict seems to ignore the fact that we armed the Taliban back in the 80s to go ahead and fight against the Russians. Now the Russians are just repaying us in kind, doing the exact same thing by arming the Taliban. We're fighting a proxy war and using a country to do it. They don't like it any better than anyone else would.
Spencer, I appreciate your call. Aaron, Russian payback here. It's definitely true that we supported those who gave them fits in Afghanistan. Is it payback time?
Yes, it's true that we, with the help of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, armed Pashtun militias throughout the east of the country during the Civil War. There wasn't a Taliban yet at that time, and Pakistan, as Max rightly noted, Pakistan is the patron of the Taliban. They created it. They support it. They use it as a hedge against a potential war with India. But what the caller mentioned that I would like to just make a comment on is just the length of this conflict. We think about it as 16 years. It's much older than that. One of the biggest cultural obstacles we've encountered in Afghanistan is an urban-rural divide, which has existed since before Afghanistan became a state in 1747. So for really 270 years, there's been a constant struggle between rural Pashtuns in the mountainous east and the wealthier and more urban Pashtuns of Kandahar and Kabul. And with the exception of the Taliban, which was a rural revolt, the government's been run for the whole history of the country by those wealthier, more urban, more secular and moderate Pashtuns from Kabul and Kandahar. So when we ejected the Taliban and elevated Hamid Karzai to the president, we picked a fight. We picked a side in that 3-century war, and it's a war that shows no sign of stopping anytime soon.
Ed in Chicago. Thank you for calling, Ed. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom. This conflict and war just shows all of us in the peace movement that we were right in 2001 to urge our government not to get involved in Afghanistan. We have perpetual war, very similar to what the troops on the Western Front in World War I were feeling in 1918, that this war would never end. And it shows no sign of ending, and we're forcing our troops to do multiple tours, 2, 3, 4 tours of duty, shuttling between Iraq and Afghanistan. This has to end.
Max, operationally, I mean, I can hear there's more than an operational concern in Ed's call. You can hear that too, I'm sure. But operationally, does it have to end?
Well, I can understand the frustration that the caller feels. But, the reality is it's always easy to end your involvement in a war. You can just leave. But does that mean that you're going to end the war? We tried that in the case of Iraq. We pulled all of our troops out in 2011. The result was, just as many of us feared, was the rise of ISIS, this terrible new terrorist group in the heart of the Middle East. And so we had even President Obama, who was very much opposed to the Iraq war, felt no choice but to put U.S. troops back in. What I would suggest in the case of Afghanistan is let's not rerun that experiment. We've seen how it's worked in the past. My concern is that if we leave Afghanistan, you will see the rise of a new terrorist state and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS taking hold. I think we can prevent that from happening and support the democratically elected government of Afghanistan, which is what we've been doing since 2001. And that most people in Afghanistan do not want to be ruled by the Taliban. Their only support is in rural Pashtun areas. The vast majority of the country, the people in the urban areas, the people in the non-Pashtun areas, have no desire to be dominated by the Taliban. And so I think we have a strategic as well as moral obligation to help the majority in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, resist this Pakistan-fueled extremist insurgency.
Would you walk away, Aaron?
I would not, and I don't think that the options are just stay or walk away. If you think about it, wars end when diplomats make agreements, right? We don't make peace with our friends, we make peace with our enemies. We've had a military surge, several, depending on how you think about it. We've had development surges. We've tried to do a civilian surge of aid workers and development into the country. I think we need a strategic and diplomatic surge to actually bring this war to a close. There are a number of players that have valid concerns in Afghanistan. Pakistan is not going to walk away from Afghanistan, but we need to actually engage on the diplomatic front more forcefully and actually reach a settlement. It's not impossible. We just need to work on it.
We've been talking about doing exactly that for years now, all the way back to Richard Holbrooke and more. Aaron O'Connell's new book is Our Latest, Longest War, Losing Hearts and Minds in Afghanistan. Aaron, please stand by there in Washington. And Max Boot is with us, author of Invisible Armies. I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. We'll be right back.
Support for this podcast and the following message comes from ZipRecruiter, who understands when you run a business, you've got important decisions to make every day, like hiring. ZipRecruiter makes finding quality candidates simple. With one click at ZipRecruiter.com/OP, you can post your job to 100 leading job sites across the web and manage your candidates all in one place with ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use dashboard. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by businesses of all sizes to hire. Try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/OP.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. We're talking this hour about Afghanistan and what to do. At almost 16 years, U.S. troops there and counting. Aaron O'Connell is with us, author of the new book, Our Latest Longest War. Max Boot is with us. He served as an advisor to U.S. commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan. Has written recently that the mother of all bombs was just an enormous sideshow. Doesn't really get it. Maybe a sign of desperation there that the U.S. had to use that, not a sign of strength. He's author of Invisible Armies, is the Council on Foreign Relations, joins us from New York. You can join us this hour. What do you think? Stay or go? How does this story end? Janelle in Boston. Janelle, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
I think the larger conversation that we've missed is putting Afghanistan into context with the rest of the region and the general larger policy of what we're doing and what we think the United States' role is in the world, and whether or not bombs and, military action can really kill an idea. We see the locals there. We see the neighboring countries. They're rejecting the idea that the United States can come in and police the world. So do we have to go in and win the minds and hearts of those locals and those neighboring countries to say, you guys should fight for your own land and your own democracies and your own rule? Or do we continue to prop up dictators with billions of dollars? Do we continue to spend trillions of dollars on war and regime change that, in the end, what has it proven? Besides the economic cost, there's hundreds of thousands of local lives lost. There's thousands of soldiers that we've lost. There's environmental costs from all the bombing. There's generations of young people growing up in these countries when all they've known are drones and United States bombs and death.
Janelle, let me get in here because I hear what you're saying, and I know there's a long chain of events here, and you could point to many kinds of intervention. But go back for just a moment to September 11th, 2001, and there we saw, the towers come down in the U.S., what would you have done at that moment? I mean, that's what kicked this off, right? That's what kicked this off. And what would you have done then?
I think I would have done a little bit more investigation into the funding and the source and the reasons as to why those individuals did what they did and try and find the root cause of it and who funded it. And I think if we did that, we might have been still directed to Afghanistan, but we might have also been directed to Saudi Arabia and other countries. And then at that point, you have an international community come together and say, we're not going to stand for this. And we stop propping up those regimes and those governments that are actually backdoor funding these type of organizations and groups. And then to go back to the point that the other caller made is these are the same groups that we quote unquote helped support in the 80s to overrun and fight against the Russian government. And so same thing in Syria, where we're arming quote-unquote rebels who turned out to be the exact people that are now fighting against us. We just really have to take a larger step back and say, what are we doing? Where is our money and our weapons going? And is it really actually helping the region?
Janelle, I think we've got it. Max Boot, I'll come first to you. Is there another way? I mean, is there something about the U.S. way of interacting with the world that's creating these, what seem like necessities of military intervention? Janelle wants to find a different kind of interaction.
Well, the caller is idealistic but ill-informed. I actually hold the Jeane Kirkpatrick Chair in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the namesake of that chair, Jeane Kirkpatrick, once talked in the 1980s about the Blame America First crowd. And to me, the caller sounds like somebody who wants to blame America first. And I'm not saying that we're perfect. We've made vast mistakes, believe me, and I've been very critical of many of the mistakes that we've made and continue to make. But I think it's pretty silly to blame us for the war that's going on in Afghanistan or the war that's going on in Syria. We're responding to events on the ground. And I can join the caller in being critical of the United States for sometimes supporting dictators, but in the case of Afghanistan, we are not supporting a dictator. We are supporting a pro-Western reformer, Ashraf Ghani, who was democratically elected, and we are standing with the majority of the people in Afghanistan who don't want to be ruled by this tyrannical Taliban movement. Remember who the Taliban are. These are not good guys. They are people who stone gays, who stone adulterers, who banned music and kite flying, who oppressed the people of Afghanistan, such that the people of Afghanistan were delighted to throw off the yoke of Taliban rule in the fall of 2001 when we backed the Northern Alliance after the attack on 9/11. So, we've made huge mistakes in Afghanistan, just as we've made in Iraq and elsewhere, but the caller is being pretty one-sided and suggesting this is all America's fault. No, it isn't. We're responding to aggression, just as we responded to the aggression of 9/11. We're responding to the continuing aggression in Afghanistan by the Taliban, which is an extremist Islamist movement supported by Pakistan and others.
Yeah. Aaron, let me put it to you. Is there another way here? Is the U.S. responding to events in a way that it must, or is it, I don't know, a prisoner of circumstances that it helped create? Right. You hear Janelle saying there must be another way of interacting with the world here.
Right. So Max is absolutely right that we did not create the Taliban. I don't think the caller was suggesting that quite in such stark terms.
There are people who look back to our funding of opposition to the Soviets,
yes,
and say, well, there you've got the CIA was all over there. They were arming, and you essentially armed up a group that morphed, and pretty soon you've got Al-Qaeda, and pretty soon you've got Taliban problems. I don't know.
Right. Well, there are different groups in the mountains of Afghanistan. It's a very tricky region, and it's fair to say that the Pakistani ISI created the Taliban, and that we entered into a series of agreements and arrangements with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to fund the most religiously extreme anti-Russian groups we could find. That part is fair.
So, hello.
But, we have to be specific, right? We did not create the Taliban. We did not create Al-Qaeda. To say so is historically inaccurate. But Janelle was making a larger point, and I would like to agree with her on part of it. There's no question that September 11th expanded the U.S. military's role in a series of non-military foreign policy endeavors. Development, rule of law, counter-narcotics, even literacy programs. We've been trying that in Afghanistan for 15 years. And the hard truth is that while the military is very good at breaking things down, it's not well suited to building them up. 95% of the funds spent in Afghanistan, which are coming up on about $800 billion at this point, almost $1 trillion, have been spent by the Department of Defense. So we need to think more, and we need to think better about how to do armed nation building, or even if we should do it in the first place. We like to say we don't do it. Indeed, both Presidents Bush and Obama said explicitly that we would not do nation building in Afghanistan. But by 2009, the U.S. is funding or running every service governments provide, from the police to prisons to the courts to universities to roads, everything. And our research has shown that a lot of those efforts just have come at great cost and with fairly questionable results.
If they can't run their own, how do you get to this diplomatically architected, exit? I mean, James is asking online here, what is the desired end state? Please articulate what Afghanistan is supposed to look like at the end of any intervention.
Right. Well, the end state actually has been consistent since the beginning, which is an Afghan government that can secure and govern itself without allowing safe havens to development for transnational terrorist groups that can threaten the United States.
But we're running everything and we can't get out. And you say that there's some diplomatic breakthrough. What is that?
I hope there can be a diplomatic breakthrough, and I think it's possible. I would suggest that we haven't fully invested diplomatically in the region. Look, Afghanistan is a country about the size of Texas. It's got 30 million people. It's right next door to Pakistan, which is 6 times its size. And the Pashtuns of the world, 50 million people that reach across both countries. The problem that we are facing lies in the Pashtun regions. To think we can solve that without seriously talking to Pakistan, without seriously talking to the Taliban, without actually bringing in other players in the region. Obviously, Pakistan is doing everything it's doing as a hedge against India. They have relevant stakes here. So there are parties with interests that are run by governments with whom we have diplomatic relations. The idea that we will never talk to the Taliban because they're a terrorist group is silly. It's a time
We've already
it's an
tried,
idea whose time has come. We have tried to a degree. I think a new administration comes in with a great deal of leverage. And he should consider using it.
Or with the mother of all bombs. Peter in Boston. Peter, thank you for calling. You're on the air. Hello, Peter. Are you there? Well, let's go to Dana in New Britain, Connecticut. Dana, you're on the air.
Yes. Thank you for letting me on. I just want to say really quickly, okay, I am a member of the alt-right, so-called alt-right. I was at the Hailgate thing with Richard Spencer in Washington, D.C. I
hated seeing that, Dana. I just got to say, I hated all that, like Hitler salute stuff. But what do you think about Afghanistan?
Okay. Well, with that aside, I just want to say I think I represent a huge section of this movement when I say we feel completely betrayed by Trump. And as soon as he did this action with the Tomahawks, which I think was totally for domestic consumption.
You mean on Syria, the big attack on the airstrip in Syria?
Absolutely, which no evidence was provided that it was indeed Assad and not the rebels. When UN inspectors in 2003 showed that they were trying to blame.
So what's the betrayal? What's the betrayal you feel, Dana?
The betrayal is that we thought we were getting America first. Let's walls, not wars, is what our chant was. And you had the left. I can't believe how the liberals and the left. They're all crowd hammers. They didn't like these guys. They didn't like Trump, and now all of a sudden they're applauding him for this intervention. And we wanted to stay out of the Middle East, and work on.
What about the mother of all bombs, Dana? How'd you feel about that? The mother of all bombs.
Well, I don't. See, that's not regime change against Assad, so it's not as bad. But essentially, I don't understand why we have to have 100. As far as I'm concerned, I'm off the Trump train as of now, because he's no better than he's caving into the neocons and the liberals, the very people that hate him, and it's insanity. I mean, we did not want war. We want a Pat Buchanan foreign policy.
Dana, we've got it. I appreciate your call. Walls, not wars. I don't think Charles Krauthammer is going to be so buying the depiction of him as left. If he's left, you're very alt-right, my friend. Or I don't know about friend. But Max Boot, walls, not wars.
Well, I just have to laugh at and shed some crocodile tears at the poor neo-Nazis, which is a more accurate term for the alt-right, being upset with Donald Trump for not faithfully carrying out their agenda. Hey, guess what? He changes positions, about as often as he changes ties. I mean, this is not a guy that you can count on for any kind of consistency. I mean, he's been all over the map. He's taken every position as well as the opposite, and so he's a nonstop flip-flopper, which is those of us who were critical of him last year warned about this, that you could not, take seriously the things that he said. And so it's pretty amusing to hear his extremist supporters now being disillusioned, but at the same time, I would not say that he's necessarily hewing to a consistent mainstream moderate path, which I would like to see more of. I mean, just today we read that he's entering into a major dispute with Canada, of all countries, and imposing tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. So he's very erratic, but I guess to the extent that there's any good news about Trump, it's that he's not living up to the fondest hopes of his craziest supporters like that caller.
Carlos in Austin, Texas. Carlos, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
I'm actually a veteran, and I served in Afghanistan for 16 months as a contractor.
Yep.
I'm going to make this really quick, and then I'll get off. You can ask all these advisors and bureaucrats all the questions you want, and you're going to get the same answers we've heard for the last 10 years. The reality is, if you ask anybody who's been on the ground, this is coming from veterans of 30 years who I worked with as contractors. We've been fighting 16 one-year wars. We rotate people out every single year. And everybody thinks they can go in and change whatever was done before. But the reality is you can't. And this is not a winnable war. By any definition of past wars, we have lost this. We just don't want to admit it. And to answer your question from before, what would I have done? Not gone into Iraq. Thank you.
Well, hey, Carlos, what would you do now in Afghanistan?
Get out. We're creating another generation of terrorists. You're creating a generation of poverty here by spending trillions of dollars over there. And we're literally funding everything when we should be funding things back home when our infrastructure is falling apart and our education system is going into the toilet rather than supporting something that is clearly a lost cause.
I appreciate your call, Carlos. Aaron, a call there from what will soon be your home in Austin, Texas. I mean, it's a different backdrop from our caller from Connecticut, but a similar, in some way, message. Spend the money at home, get out of there.
Yeah, I don't think either the caller from Texas or from New Britain, Connecticut, have given quite as much thought as is necessary on how to get out. I think that people on the left and on the right who think seriously about the U.S.'s role in the world probably agree that walls is no path to operating in a globalized economy and in a globalized world. The concern about never-ending wars, however, is a reasonable one to have. I mean, let's be clear about this. The United States is using violence right now in at least six countries around the world. The authorization for the use of military force from 2001 authorizes military violence in any country in the world for any indeterminate period of time.
And you're throwing in Yemen and Somalia and more.
That's right. This is we'd like to think that that's not an American tradition, but it's been an American tradition for 15 years. And in fact, an over-militarized approach to foreign policy has been an American tradition for much, much longer. So we do need to think about how the United States interacts with the world. And I think it's a fair statement to say that we are military heavy in that approach and that's generating some blowback.
If we have to get India and Pakistan to come to terms before we can get a diplomatic agreement that would let us out of Afghanistan, we could wait forever, couldn't we?
Indeed.
But isn't that the key to the diplomatic solution ultimately that you're promoting?
I don't think that we will get India and Pakistan to solve all their problems. And I don't think the United States is either in the position to do that, nor could it if it dramatically ramped up its expenditures. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to reach diplomatic solutions. Diplomacy has done some marvelous things in the history of the United States, right? I mean, diplomacy brought the French into the American Revolution and helped us win the war. Diplomacy has done a number of things, and there are a lot of players that have real equities in the region, from Pakistan to India to China to Russia. Who's to say we cannot involve them in some kind of bargain?
Good conversation. No really good path that I can see here. Aaron O'Connell says diplomacy. Max Boot, the phrase that will stick with me is perpetuity here. Stalemate in perpetuity. And there we are in Afghanistan. Wow. Max Boot, Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, with us today from New York, author of Invisible Armies. Max, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Aaron O'Connell, author of Our Latest, Longest War, Losing Hearts and Minds in Afghanistan. Aaron, thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point.